Picture a single copper wire, no thicker than a man's finger, lying alone on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. 2 miles of black water above it, 2,000 miles of empty sea around it. No light reaches it. No ship can see it. No diver in the world could ever touch it. And through that thin thread, a message crosses from one continent to another in a matter of minutes, when before it would have taken 12 days by ship. That is the part that stops me. They did this in the 1850s and 60s. No satellites, no sonar maps worth the name. No engines that could hold a ship steady against the swell while it paid out a wire mile after mile after mile into water deeper than most mountains are tall. They did it with iron ships, coils of cable packed into flooded tanks, brass instruments read by men squinting in the dark, and one stubborn American who refused to stop after the ocean swallowed his work again and again. His name was Cyrus West Field. And before I tell you how the wire went down, I want to be honest with you about something, because this channel does not flatter the past with lies. This was an American dream carried by an American who would not quit. But it was not an American achievement alone. The ships were British. Much of the money was British. Some of the finest engineers and scientists were British. Cyrus Field was the man who held it all together, who crossed the ocean again and again to keep the dream alive, who was the public face and the relentless heart of it. So when I say America laid a cable across the Atlantic, understand what I mean. America had the man who would not let it die. The work was shared. The triumph belonged to 2 nations and to a few thousand sailors and cable hands whose names the records mostly did not bother to keep. Let me start with the size of the thing, because until you feel the scale, none of the rest will land. The Atlantic Ocean between Newfoundland and Ireland is roughly 2,000 miles across. The seabed there is not flat. It rises and falls in ridges and trenches, and in the deepest stretches the water runs more than 2 miles down, around 10,500 feet, deeper than any line men had ever tried to lower with purpose. An American naval officer named Matthew Fontaine Maury had spent years taking soundings of that ocean floor, dropping weighted lines off ships to measure the depth, and he found that there was a kind of broad shelf running across the middle of the North Atlantic, gentle enough that a cable might rest on it without snapping over a cliff edge. Maury called it the Telegraph Plateau. It was, in a sense, the only reason any sane person could even imagine trying. Now think about what they did not have. No machine existed that could spool out 2,000 miles of cable on its own. No engine could keep a ship at a steady crawl for 2 and 3 weeks in open ocean, while the wire ran out over the stern at exactly the right speed. Not too fast, or it would run off and be lost. Not too slow, or the ship would drag it and snap it. No instrument was sensitive enough, at first, to even hear a whisper of electricity after it had traveled 2,000 miles through a thin copper thread under the sea. They had to invent the answers as they went, and they paid for the lessons with broken cable and broken hopes. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. The story is only just starting, and the best parts are still under the water. So let me tell you about the cable itself, because the wire was the whole secret, and most people never stop to think about what it actually was. At the center sat a copper core, 7 thin strands of copper twisted together, no thicker than a piece of stout twine. That copper carried the electric signal. Copper alone would have been useless in salt water. Salt water conducts electricity, and the moment current touched the sea, it would have leaked away into the ocean and vanished. So the copper had to be wrapped, sealed, made watertight along every single mile of its length, with no gap, no crack, no flaw, because one bad spot anywhere in 2,000 miles could ruin the whole line. The sealant was a strange tropical gum called gutta percha. It comes from the sap of a tree that grows in the islands of Southeast Asia, and it has a remarkable property. When warm, it is soft and can be molded around a wire. When it cools, it turns hard and rubbery, and most importantly, it does not let water through. Layer after layer of gutta percha was pressed around the copper core. The first cable used something like 300 tons of the stuff, melted and molded by hand and machine in English factories over the copper, sealing it from the sea. Around the insulation came padding of tarred hemp, and around that came the armor, a sheath of iron wires wound in a spiral to give the cable strength so it would not part under its own weight as it hung in the water. The finished cable for the first try was thin, only about 5/8 of an inch thick, and it weighed roughly 107 pounds for every mile at sea. That sounds light. It was too light, as it turned out, and some of the engineers said so at the time and were overruled. But hold that thought. To carry 2,000 miles of this cable, they coiled it into enormous tanks, great circular wells built into the holds of the ships, and the coiling was done by hand, men walking the cable around and around in tightening rings, day after day, until the holds were filled with miles of black rope sleeping in coils like some sea creature waiting to be let down into the dark. On the later voyages, the tanks were even flooded with water, so the cable stayed wet and supple, the way it would be in the ocean, and would not dry out and crack before its time. And the whole length had to be tested as it went. The electricians never stopped sending a test current through the wire, all day and all night, in shifts. As long as the signal came back clean, they knew the cable behind them was still alive on the bottom. The moment the signal changed or died, they knew something had gone wrong out there in the dark, and they had to stop and search and sometimes haul miles of cable back up to find the fault. It was nerve-wracking, unending work, watching a needle for the smallest flicker, knowing that the slightest fault could undo weeks of labor and a fortune in cable. So that was the wire. Now the first attempt. In the summer of 1857, two great warships were chosen to carry it. One was American, the steam frigate U.S.S. Niagara, one of the largest warships of her day. The other was British, H.M.S. Agamemnon, a ship of the line. Each took on half the cable, so much weight that loading it took weeks and left the ships riding low and heavy. The plan was for the Niagara to start at the Irish coast, lay her half going west, and at the middle of the ocean splice her end to the Agamemnons, which would carry on to Newfoundland. They began near the southwest coast of Ireland in early August of 1857. Within the first few miles, the cable fouled in the machinery and broke. They fished it up and spliced it and went on. Then, a few days out, over deep water, the paying out machine, the device with brakes that controlled how fast the cable ran off the stern, was set too tight against a sudden pitch of the ship. The strain snapped the cable and it fell away into more than 2 miles of water, gone, beyond any hope of recovery. They had lost about 300 miles of cable and the whole season with it. They turned for home. Cyrus Field did not quit. He went back to the investors, back across the ocean, and got them to try again the next year. The summer of 1858 was worse before it was better. This time, the plan changed. The two ships, Niagara and Agamemnon, would meet in the middle of the ocean, splice the cable there, and then steam away from each other in opposite directions, one to Ireland, one to Newfoundland, laying as they went. They set out in June. 10 days into the voyage, a furious storm caught them. The Agamemnon, top-heavy with hundreds of tons of cable coiled high in her holds, rolled so violently that the coils shifted and threatened to crush the men. Sailors were thrown about and injured. The cabin holding the delicate electrical instruments was flooded. The ship nearly went over. She survived, barely, and they pressed on. They met at mid-ocean and spliced the cable and began. It broke after less than 3 miles. They started over. It broke again after about 54 miles. They started over a third time, after some 200 miles had run out from each ship, and it broke yet again. The ships turned back to Ireland in something close to despair. The directors of the company in London were ready to give up and sell the remaining cable for whatever they could get. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Cyrus Field talked them out of quitting. There was still cable left. There was still a season. He pushed, and they tried once more. In the middle of July, the ships went out again, met at mid-ocean, spliced, and steamed apart. And this time the cable held. Mile after mile it ran out over the sterns and sank into the dark and kept its signal alive. The Niagara reached the Newfoundland coast in early August. The Agamemnon reached Ireland the next day. The two ends of the wire now touched 2 continents. For the first time in human history, a current could be sent from Europe to America without crossing the open sea in a ship. What happened next was one of the great public celebrations of the 19th century, and also one of its great humiliations, and the two were only weeks apart. On the 16th of August, 1858, Queen Victoria sent a message to President James Buchanan through the cable. It was a message of friendship and congratulation, 98 words long. And here is a detail that tells you everything about how primitive the signaling still was. That message of 98 words took about 16 hours to send. The current was so faint after crossing 2,000 miles of ocean that it crawled through one slow flicker at a time, roughly one word every several minutes. But it crossed. The Queen's words reached Washington, and the President answered, and the news set off a frenzy. In New York, a 100-gun salute was fired. Church bells rang across the city. Flags hung from every building. At night, the whole city was lit up. There was a great parade with a torchlight procession after dark, and a fireworks display so enthusiastic that the sparks set the dome of the city hall on fire and part of the building burned. Ministers preached sermons calling the cable a work of providence, a binding of the nations, a near miracle. Shares in the company doubled. The men who had built it were toasted as heroes. The English engineer in charge of the work, Charles Bright, was knighted at the age of 26. Cyrus Field, the American who had held it all together for years, was the most celebrated man in 2 countries. And then the cable began to die. The signal had always been weak, and now it grew weaker by the day. Part of the cause lay in the wire itself. We know now, from study of the recovered cable long after, that the copper core in places had not been centered properly in its insulation, and the gutta percha had flaws. The cable was, in a quiet way, doomed from the factory. But there was a second cause, and it had a name. The chief electrician on the eastern end was a man named Wildman Whitehouse. Whitehouse believed that the way to push a stronger signal through a failing cable was to push harder, to drive more powerful jolts of electricity into the wire. He used enormous induction coils and sent surges of up to 2,000 volts down the cable. 2,000 volts into a thin copper thread sealed in a soft gum insulation that had never been built to take it. He was, in effect, burning out the very thing he was trying to save. The high voltage broke down the insulation, and the leaks grew, and the signal faded toward nothing. Standing against Whitehouse was the man who would prove to be the true scientific hero of the whole affair. His name was William Thomson, a Scottish physicist, later raised to the peerage as Lord Kelvin, one of the great minds of the age. Thomson understood the cable in a way Whitehouse never did. He knew the signal would always be faint, and that the answer was not to shout louder but to listen better. He had invented an instrument called the mirror galvanometer, a device so sensitive it could detect the tiniest whisper of current. A tiny magnet hung from a silk thread with a little mirror attached to it. When the faint signal arrived, the magnet twitched, the mirror turned a hair's width, and a beam of light reflected off it swung across a scale on the wall, magnifying a movement too small for any eye to see into something a man could read. Thomson's instrument could hear what Whitehouse was trying to overpower. But first, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one unless enough people click. One click. Come back. In its few weeks of life, that first cable did carry real messages. Several hundred of them went across before it failed, and at least one of them mattered. A message went through that countermanded an order to move British troops between stations, a movement no longer needed, and the saved expense alone was reckoned in the tens of thousands of pounds. So the cable proved the idea was real even as it died. By early September of 1858, the line had gone silent for good. Whitehouse was dismissed in disgrace. The newspapers that had called the cable a miracle now whispered that it had all been a fraud, or a fluke, or a fairy tale. The celebration curdled into doubt. Many believed the Atlantic could never truly be spanned. Cyrus Field still did not quit, but the world made him wait. The American Civil War broke out, and for 4 bloody years there was no money and no appetite for an ocean cable. Field kept the dream on life support through those years, crossing the Atlantic again and again to keep his English partners and investors from scattering. In all, over the long arc of the project, this one man made more than 50 crossings of the ocean by ship, back and forth between New York and London, year after year, to chase a wire he could not see. Think about that. More than 50 crossings of the open Atlantic in the age of sail and early steam, just to keep a dream from dying. When the war ended, the technology had grown up. There was a better cable now, heavier, stronger, far better insulated, the kind the careful engineers had wanted all along. And there was, by an extraordinary coincidence, Exactly one ship in the world, big enough to carry the whole 2,000 miles of it in a single hull. That ship was the Great Eastern. The Great Eastern was a Leviathan, a vessel so far ahead of her time that she made no commercial sense and broke the men who built her. She had been designed by the great British engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who poured himself into her and died, worn out, just days after she first prepared for sea. She was nearly 700 feet long, almost double the length of any other ship afloat, and she would hold the record as the largest ship in the world for nearly half a century. As a passenger liner, she had been a financial disaster, too big for her age. But for laying cable, she was perfect, because she alone could swallow the entire ocean in her holds. They built great cable tanks down inside her, vast circular wells, and filled them with water, and into that water they coiled mile upon mile of the new cable, more than 2,000 miles of it, thousands of tons of iron and copper and gutta percha resting in flooded tanks deep in the hull. From her stern they rigged the paying-out machinery, the wheels and brakes and guides that would let the cable run out smoothly into the sea behind her as she crawled westward. In the summer of 1865, the Great Eastern set out from the west of Ireland and began to lay. And for a while it went beautifully. Day after day, the great ship moved west across the empty ocean, the cable streaming off her stern, the signal back to Ireland strong and clear. They were perhaps 2/3 of the way to Newfoundland. And then the cable parted. It broke and fell into water 2 miles deep, and the end was lost. They tried to grapple for it, dragging hooks along the seabed 2 miles down, hoping to snag a wire they could not see, and they actually caught it more than once, only to have the grappling line break and lose it again. After days of fishing and 2 miles of water, they gave up and steamed home beaten once more. One quick note. I turned the full story of the first transatlantic telegraph cable into a book, everything the records gave me, all the names and all the numbers. If you want it, the link is in the description. And still, Cyrus Field did not quit. He came back the very next year. In the summer of 1866, the Great Eastern went out again with a fresh cable. This time everything came together. The ship laid the cable across the whole width of the Atlantic without a single fatal break, and on the 27th of July, 1866, she reached the little harbor of Heart's Content in Newfoundland and brought the working end of the wire ashore. The cable held. The signal was strong and steady, and this time it would not die, and the speed was transformed. Where the first cable had crawled at roughly a word every few minutes, the new line could carry around 8 words a minute, dozens of times faster, fast enough to be truly useful, fast enough to change the world. But the men of the Great Eastern were not finished. They turned around and went back out to sea, to the place where the cable of the year before had been lost, and they did one of the most astonishing things in the whole story. With grappling hooks dragged along the bottom in 2 miles of black water, guided by the first officer Robert Halpin and a crew working day after day, they fished for the lost wire of 1865. They snagged it. They lost it. They snagged it again. And finally they brought the cut end of that lost cable up from 2 miles down, hauled it dripping onto the deck of the great ship, tested it, found it still alive, spliced fresh cable to it, and carried it on to Newfoundland too. So they did not just lay one cable across the Atlantic that year. They laid one, and then they raised a second from the floor of the ocean and finished it. 2 working cables, where for years there had been none. Now let me speak for the men whose names we do not have, because there were thousands of them, and the records mostly let them slip away. We know Cyrus Field. We know William Thomson, who would be knighted for this work and remembered as Lord Kelvin. We know Charles Bright and Isambard Brunel and Robert Halpin. But the men who coiled the cable hand over hand for weeks until the holds were full, the stokers who fed the furnaces, the cable hands who stood at the stern in the cold and the spray watching the wire run out and knowing a single snag meant the end, the sailors who held the Agamemnon upright through that murderous storm, the men who dragged the grappling lines through 2 miles of water for day after day only to lose the cable and start again, those men are almost entirely nameless to us now. The newspapers wrote about the Queen and the President. They did not write down the names of the man who tightened the brake or the man who spliced the wire in the dark. That loss is real, and I will not pretend otherwise. The wire was laid by their hands as much as by anyone's, and history kept their work and forgot their names. The cost of all of it was enormous. Years of labor. A fortune in money, much of it lost in the failures, much of it British, and a large share of it staked personally by Cyrus Field himself, who put a quarter of the early capital in with his own hands and was nearly ruined more than once. 3 separate cables were dropped into the deep and lost before a single working line stayed. The Atlantic took their work in 1857, took it again across the storms and breaks of 1858, killed the celebrated cable within weeks that same year, and took the cable of 1865 down into 2 miles of water. 4 years of war stopped everything in the middle. Reputations were destroyed. Men were called liars and fools. And through every bit of it, the ocean asked the same simple, brutal question over and over. How badly do you want this? Cyrus Field answered the same way every time. Badly enough to cross the ocean more than 50 times. Badly enough to try again. And here is what they bought with all of it. Before the cable, a message between Europe and America had to travel by ship. 10 days at best. 12 or more in winter storms. A piece of news, a price, an order, a declaration of war or peace was always at least a week and a half out of date by the time it arrived. Markets on the 2 sides of the ocean were strangers to each other. Governments learned of each other's actions long after the fact. A family could not know for weeks whether a loved one who had crossed the sea had arrived alive. The Atlantic was not just water. It was a wall of time. The cable knocked the wall down. After 1866, a message and its answer could cross the ocean and come back in the same day. The price of cotton in Liverpool and the price in New York became the same conversation. Diplomats could speak across the sea while the matter was still fresh. News that had taken a fortnight now took minutes. The world, for the first time, began to feel small. Some people at the time understood exactly what had happened. They said the 2 continents had been joined, that the old separation was over, that distance itself had been beaten. They were right, and the wire never really went away. What Cyrus Field and his British partners began at Heart's Content in 1866 did not stop there. The Great Eastern went on to lay tens of thousands of miles of cable across the oceans of the world in the years that followed, more than 30,000 miles of it before her cable-laying days were over. Cable after cable was strung across the Atlantic, then across other seas, until within a few decades, a web of telegraph wires lay on the floors of the oceans connecting the continents. The lonely copper thread on the seabed became a network, and that network never disappeared. It only grew. The fiber optic cables that carry the modern world across the oceans today, the lines that move our calls and our money, and these very words, run along the same idea, in many cases along the same routes, that Cyrus Field's stubbornness opened. Every time something you send crosses an ocean in an instant, it is traveling a road that was first cut by an iron ship, paying out a copper wire into the dark, by men whose names we lost, by an American who would not quit. Go to Heart's Content in Newfoundland today, and you can still find the old station where the cable came ashore, kept now as a historic site, the old instruments quiet behind glass. The first cable of 1858 is still down there in the deep, dead and forgotten on the telegraph plateau, 2 miles under the surface, the gutta percha long since done failing. The Great Eastern is long gone, broken up for scrap, too big for the century that made her. Cyrus Field died in 1892, his fortune mostly gone by the end, the great triumph of his life already half forgotten by a world that had moved on to take the cable for granted, the way we take it for granted right now. But the wire is still there. The idea is still there. Every ocean on Earth has a cable running across its floor, in the dark, in the cold, carrying voices between continents. Because more than 150 years ago, a few thousand men, and one American, who would not stop, proved that the sea was not a wall, after all. It was only water. And a thin copper thread, laid by hand, could reach all the way across. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.